The story of Saint Nicholas begins in one of the most challenging and fascinating periods of the Church, when Christianity was still being consolidated as a spiritual and moral force within a world marked by political tensions, cultural struggles, and religious persecutions. Nicholas was born around the year 270 in the city of Patara, in the region of Lycia, in what is now the territory of Turkey, a prosperous coastal environment that was culturally active. Lycia was under the dominion of the Roman Empire, but it carried deeply rooted local traditions and a diverse religiosity that influenced people's daily lives. In this complex setting, Christianity emerged as a firm yet still vulnerable faith, frequently being the target of distrust and hostility. The birth of Nicholas, therefore, did not take place in peaceful times, but in the midst of a society that was rapidly changing, where courage and fidelity were essential virtues for the survival of those who followed Jesus Christ. Nicholas's family was deeply Christian and known in the region for its charitable spirit and exemplary conduct. His parents, Theophanes and Nona, were people of great faith, respected by the community both for their social standing and for their upright lives. They did not possess extravagant wealth, but they lived with dignity and always placed God at the center of everything. It was within this atmosphere of sincere devotion that Nicholas took his first steps, learning from an early age that true greatness does not lie in the accumulation of possessions, but in the ability to serve others out of love for Christ. The education he received in his home would profoundly shape his way of seeing the world, teaching him that faith must be lived in practice in every daily gesture, especially in favor of the poorest and most vulnerable. His birth was accompanied by strong devotion on the part of his parents, who had already faced the suffering of sterility for many years. According to ancient traditions, Nicholas's arrival was seen as a true gift from heaven, the fruit of many prayers and supplications. He grew up being educated by his own parents in Christian doctrine, learning biblical stories, prayers, and hymns that would become pillars of his spirituality. From a young age, he showed a rare sensitivity to sacred things, preferring moments of prayer to the common games of children his age. This behavior, far from being forced, sprang naturally from his heart, which seemed inclined from the beginning toward love and divine mercy. Nicholas's childhood was marked by episodes that already revealed the greatness of his future vocation. Ancient accounts describe that, even as a child, he displayed a deep sense of justice and compassion. While other children argued or competed with one another, Nicholas preferred to help the weaker ones, share what he had, and comfort those who suffered. The people around him perceived that there was something different about him, a serenity and firmness that did not match his young age. The harmony between his gentle nature and his strong moral sense made him a living example, even before he began his religious ministry. As the years passed, Nicholas received a solid formation in philosophy, rhetoric, and theology, something common among young men of more established Christian families. This education did not serve merely to make him cultured or eloquent, but to deepen his understanding of God, of the Church, and of the spiritual role he was beginning to discern for his life. His knowledge of Scripture was impressive, especially for someone so young, and his ability to explain difficult passages attracted the attention even of the older members of the community. Many believed that the hand of God rested upon him in a special way, preparing him for a grand mission that was yet to come. However, Nicholas's youth was also marked by pain and loss. While still relatively young, he lost his parents in an epidemic that struck the region, leaving him orphaned and deeply shaken. Suffering, however, was not able to destroy him spiritually. On the contrary, this tragedy intensified his faith and led him to seek a more intimate union with God. He understood that earthly life is fleeting and that all wealth, including emotional wealth, must be lived with gratitude, but without prideful attachment. Upon inheriting the family's goods, Nicholas made a radical decision. He would use everything he possessed to help the poor, the orphans, and the needy, making charity the great axis of his existence. This period of solitude and discernment was fundamental for his spiritual maturation. Without the physical presence of his parents, Nicholas found in God the paternal and maternal figure who would guide him for the rest of his life. He immersed himself in prayer, fasting, and reading of the scriptures, seeking in each gesture to draw nearer to holiness. The community observed his dedication and saw in him a young man who seemed destined for something greater than a simple, ordinary life. His behavior inspired trust, and many already sought him out to ask for spiritual advice, as if they saw in him a sure beacon amid the storms of life. From that moment on, the fame of his generosity began to spread. Nicholas, even without desiring recognition, became known for acts of charity carried out discreetly and silently. He believed deeply in the words of Jesus that taught doing good without seeking applause, hiding the hand that gives and offering each gesture as a sacrifice pleasing to God. His works were not born of vanity, but of the authentic expression of a heart wholly inflamed by Christian love. From these simple gestures, the figure of Nicholas began to take shape as a true imitator of Christ. The historical environment of that time also strengthened his vocation. Christianity was beginning to gain ground in the Roman Empire, but it was still persecuted in many places, and the followers of Jesus lived under the constant risk of reprisals. Nicholas knew that following Christ meant carrying the cross, facing insults, and often risking one's own life. Even so, he remained steadfast, confident that God would sustain those who remained faithful. His quiet courage became a powerful testimony for the local Christian community. All this initial formation, marked by the faith of his family, by solid education, by the pain of loss, and by the practice of charity, prepared Nicholas for the challenges he would face in the years to come. He still did not imagine that he would become one of the most beloved and venerated bishops of the ancient church, a symbol of generosity, courage, and holiness. But God was already leading him, discreetly, toward the mission that would transform his life and leave an indelible mark on the history of Christendom. Thus began the journey of the one who, centuries later, would be recognized as one of the most popular saints in the world, an inspiration for generations and a model of unshakable faith. The youth of St. Nicholas was accompanied by a deep sensitivity to human needs, something that manifested itself so intensely that many saw him as a true instrument of divine providence. Moved by this genuine compassion, he began to practice charity in secret, avoiding any form of recognition. This attitude did not stem from excessive timidity, but from his profound Christian conviction. Everything should be done for the glory of God and not for one's own exaltation. Living discreetly, Nicholas often went out at night to take food, coins, or provisions to the homes of needy families. This quiet and sacrificial way of life would shape the basis of his spirituality and become one of the most striking characteristics of his holiness. One of the best-known episodes of his charity is the story of the 3 young women who lived in extreme poverty. Their father, desperate and unable to provide a dignified future for his daughters, feared that they would be led into infamy due to the lack of resources for marriage. Upon hearing about this drama, Nicholas acted without hesitation. For 3 consecutive nights, he left bags of gold at the window, or, according to some traditions, in the chimney of the family's house. The way he acted, in complete secrecy and without ever seeking credit for his generosity, deeply touched that family's heart and became a universal symbol of his silent love. This episode not only saved those young women, but would also become the remote origin of the Christian tradition that, centuries later, would inspire the figure of St. Nicholas as the prototype of the generous distributor of gifts. The fame of these gestures began to spread, even against the saint's will, because true charity always finds a way to illuminate the world around it. People from various regions began to hear accounts about the young man who distributed help without asking for anything in return. Many families testified, moved, to the providential intervention that always came in the most critical moments. The silent presence of Nicholas transformed environments of despair into spaces of hope, showing that God does not abandon those who trust in his mercy. In all these gestures, Nicholas showed his profound adherence to the gospel, particularly to Jesus' words about giving alms in secret, to be rewarded only by the Father who sees what is hidden. Besides his material charity, Nicholas also began to be recognized for extraordinary signs that accompanied his life of prayer. There are accounts that, once during a strong storm that threatened to destroy ships off the coast of Lycia, Nicholas fervently interceded for the sailors who were at risk of death. By the end of the night, the storm suddenly ceased, allowing everyone to return home without loss. The event was seen by the population as a miracle, and many began to attribute to the young man divine protection over those who faced the dangers of the sea. This episode would deeply mark his relationship with sailors, who later recognized him as their patron. Nicholas's spirituality blossomed with the strength of someone who allowed himself to be guided entirely by God. Even as a young man, he showed impressive spiritual discernment, capable of identifying situations of injustice, abuse, or suffering and acting with prudence and compassion. His life was built on three essential pillars: constant prayer, practical charity, and faithful observance of the gospel. He spent long periods in silence before God, seeking to understand his will. This interior habit granted him a serenity that inspired confidence in all who approached him. It was as if he carried within himself a deep peace, a stability that naturally emanated and touched the most afflicted hearts. His reputation grew not because he sought it, but because his holiness was too evident to remain hidden. The elders of the community, perceiving his spiritual maturity, began to invite him to assist in the local religious life, asking him to preach, help with the distribution of alms, and counsel families in difficulty. Nicholas, however, did all this with great humility, always acknowledging that it was God acting through him. He did not consider himself worthy of any distinction and constantly asked God to keep him far from pride. His modesty made him even more beloved, and his presence was seen as a blessing wherever he went. Another significant account from his youth is the episode of the sailor who fell from the mast during a voyage and died instantly. The ship carried goods and was heading toward the city of Myra when, faced with the despair of the crew, Nicholas is said to have interceded with tears for that man's life. To everyone's astonishment, the sailor came back to life shortly afterward, fully recovered. The seamen prostrated themselves before the saint, recognizing that Nicholas's intercession had saved their companion. This event spread like wildfire throughout the coastal regions, further strengthening his fame as a protector of those who face storms and maritime dangers. Despite the miracles that accompanied him, Nicholas never sought prestige or political influence. On the contrary, he continued to live simply, devoting himself to prayer and works of mercy. His heart remained free from earthly ambitions, and his only concern was to imitate Christ faithfully. This deep humility strongly contrasted with the prevailing mentality of the time, marked by the quest for power and glory. Nicholas became a living sign of Christian counterculture, someone who preferred simplicity to ostentation, service to status, truth to convenience. This stance would decisively influence his path toward the episcopate. Even so, Nicholas faced temptations and inner trials. The public recognition of his miracles and his growing fame could have inflated his ego, but he constantly fought these inclinations with prayer, penance, and interior vigilance. He knew that vanity could destroy even the most virtuous, and that the enemy often tries to seduce generous hearts with praise and honors. But Nicholas did not yield. His perseverance in humility would become one of the strongest marks of his spiritual journey, helping him remain faithful to the mission God would entrust to him in the years that followed. Thus, while he grew in virtues and charity, Nicholas was unknowingly preparing himself to assume one of the most important functions in the church, the episcopate. His pure heart, his unshakable faith, and his deep sensitivity toward the most needy would make him the ideal candidate to guide God's people in turbulent times. The community that knew him closely intuited that the kind and wise young man was being shaped directly by the hands of the Lord for an even greater mission. This mission would manifest itself in a surprising way when, by divine will, he was elected Bishop of Myra, a fact that would mark the beginning of a new and decisive stage of his life. The election of Saint Nicholas as Bishop of Myra is one of the most emblematic and spiritually impactful episodes of his life, showing how God mysteriously and surprisingly leads those he chooses. The city of Myra, located in Lycia, faced a delicate moment after the death of the former bishop. The leaders of the Christian community were looking for someone with unshakable faith, irreproachable character, and deep charity to take on the mission. Several names were suggested, but none seemed to gather all the virtues necessary to guide the flock in such challenging times. It was then that one of the elders of the church, after an intense period of prayer, received a divine inspiration that would change the course of the election. The new bishop should be the first man who entered the church door the next morning. The news spread among the priests and the faithful, who waited with expectation to see who would be the one chosen by God. The following morning, as the sun was just rising and the city slowly awakened, Nicholas walked toward the church as he did every day, moved by his deep love for prayer and silence before God. Unaware of the revelation, he entered through the main door at the exact moment when everyone present was watching attentively. The elders, moved by spiritual conviction, approached him with reverence and asked his name. Upon hearing Nicholas, they immediately confirmed that he was the man chosen by God to lead the people of Myra. Surprised and deeply moved, Nicholas tried to refuse the appointment as he considered himself unworthy of such a great responsibility. In his sincere humility, he believed he should remain in anonymity, serving quietly and helping the poor without holding positions of prominence. However, the insistence of the elders and the unanimous testimony of the community convinced him that this was indeed the divine will. He understood that God does not choose the strongest or the most capable according to the world's standards, but those whose hearts are willing to follow his ways. And so he accepted the mission with reverent fear, promising to give his life totally to the service of the church. The ceremony of Nicholas's episcopal ordination was marked by great emotion. The faithful gathered in the Cathedral of Myra, filling every space to witness the historic moment when the young man, known for his silent charity, became shepherd of the flock of Christ. During the liturgical rite, the priests laid hands on him, invoking the Holy Spirit to strengthen him with wisdom, discernment, and fortitude. Many present recount that Nicholas remained in deep prayer throughout the celebration, with discreet tears running down his face, an expression of his total surrender to the mission entrusted by God. Once bishop, Nicholas immediately took on the task of defending, teaching, and sanctifying his people. The historical context of the time presented countless challenges. The church faced persecutions, heresies began to spread, and many Christians were at risk of death for professing their faith. Nicholas was not disturbed by fear. He firmly believed that the bishop's role was to be the first to set an example of courage and fidelity. Thus, he personally visited distant communities, comforted the persecuted, upheld those who were faltering, and encouraged everyone to remain steadfast in faith in Christ, even in the face of the empire's hostility. One of his first actions as bishop was to establish organized systems of charity to help the poor, orphans, and widows, groups especially vulnerable in that society. He administered the church's resources with simplicity, avoiding any superfluous expenses and allocating almost everything to care for the needy. His episcopate became known for transforming the diocese of Myra into a real refuge for those who suffered. Merchants passing through the city testified that there was never hunger among the faithful, for the bishop personally ensured that everyone received assistance. This attitude reinforced his reputation as a good and merciful shepherd who did not govern from above, but walked among his people like a loving father. Nicholas was also an admirable preacher. His homilies attracted crowds who gathered to listen to his words, filled with wisdom, simplicity, and spiritual depth. He spoke gently, but also firmly when necessary, denouncing injustices, warning against sin, and clearly instructing about Christian doctrine. Many returned home deeply touched, determined to change their lives after hearing him. His gentle voice had a singular power to transform hardened hearts because he spoke not only from theological knowledge, but from a life entirely surrendered to God. As time passed, his fame extended beyond Myra. People from distant lands traveled to the city to ask for advice, miracles, or simply to see him. He had become a true symbol of God's paternal presence on earth. Yet, despite his growing popularity, Nicholas remained the same humble man who had once hidden his alms in his youth. He continued to walk the streets discreetly, visiting the sick, consoling widows, and carrying out works of mercy without ostentation. This consistency of character showed that his heart remained deeply rooted in the gospel. Even with the increase in responsibilities, Nicholas never abandoned his life of prayer. He dedicated long hours of the day and night to silent meditation, fasting, and contemplation of divine mysteries. He understood that without this continual union with God, he would not be able to lead the people in a just and holy way. His intense spirituality made him a man of admirable discernment, capable of making difficult decisions with serenity and spiritual clarity. This deep union with God would be essential for facing the storms to come, especially during the periods of persecution that would strike the church with ferocity. Thus, his episcopate was consolidated as one of the most inspiring of Christian antiquity. Nicholas was at once a watchful shepherd, ardent preacher, master of charity, defender of the faith, and man of deep humility. Each gesture of his seemed to confirm that his choice had truly been divine. He became not only Bishop of Myra, but also a living symbol of God's action in history. And it was in this spirit of total dedication that he would confront the great challenges of Diocletian's persecution, a decisive moment in his life that would reveal even more deeply his courage and unshakable faith. The persecution initiated by Emperor Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century was one of the darkest moments in the history of the Church, and also a decisive period in the life of Saint Nicholas. The emperor, fearing the expansion of Christianity and wanting to restore the ancient Roman religion, ordered the destruction of Christian temples, the arrest of bishops, the burning of sacred books, and the execution of the faithful who refused to worship pagan gods. The measure directly affected Myra and all of Lycia, turning daily life into an environment of constant tension and vigilance. Nicholas, as bishop, knew that his name was among the main targets of the authorities, but even so, he did not cease to exercise his mission. He continued visiting the faithful, secretly celebrating the Eucharist, and strengthening the courage of those who feared for their lives. Nicholas's courage in the face of threats was not the result of recklessness, but of absolute trust in divine providence. He was fully aware that a bishop's life should not be protected at the flock's expense, but offered out of love for his people, just as Christ gave his life for the sheep. Even knowing that he could be arrested at any time, he refused to leave the city or hide. His presence strengthened Christians who were on the verge of renouncing the faith out of fear of torture, and many found in the bishop's serenity the strength needed to remain faithful. This quiet yet powerful testimony led Nicholas to be remembered as one of the strongest shepherds of that turbulent period. His arrest inevitably took place. Roman soldiers, acting under imperial orders, invaded the episcopal residence and took Nicholas in chains before the governor. He did not resist, did not argue, and did not show fear. He simply walked with dignity, as one who knew he was participating in Christ's sufferings. When questioned about his faith, he firmly declared that he would never deny Jesus, no matter the cost. These words deeply angered the authorities, who ordered his immediate imprisonment. Nicholas was thrown into a damp, dark, overcrowded prison, together with other Christians awaiting judgment or execution. Inside the prison, his presence completely transformed the environment. Many inmates were desperate, physically and spiritually wounded, with no hope of liberation. But Nicholas, moved by pastoral love, became a true refuge within that place of darkness. He prayed with the prisoners, comforted those at the brink of death, encouraged those who feared they might falter, and taught about the saving value of suffering united to Christ's cross. The guards, noticing his unshakable serenity, were impressed. Even chained and deprived of freedom, Nicholas radiated an inner light that no human power could extinguish. The conditions in the prison were extremely harsh. Constant hunger, cold, little water, disease, and frequent abuse. Despite all this, Nicholas never murmured against God. On the contrary, he gave thanks for the opportunity to share in the pains that so many martyrs had previously endured. His deep faith inspired countless imprisoned Christians to endure the persecution with dignity. Some ancient accounts affirm that certain guards even came to ask him to pray for their families, recognizing in him a holiness that went beyond the limits of any political or religious belief. Nicholas had the gift of touching hearts even in situations of extreme suffering. Meanwhile, outside the prison, the faithful of Myra cried constantly for the liberation of their pastor. The entire community felt his absence painfully. The poor, especially, wept because they knew that no one defended them as he did. Widows and orphans were left helpless, and many feared that the diocese would succumb to discouragement. However, the memory of his courage served as strength for them to remain united. The people knew that if Nicholas were free, he would do everything to protect them. Therefore, they did all they could to keep his memory and works of charity alive during his forced absence. Nicholas's imprisonment lasted until the end of the persecutions, when Emperor Constantine came to power and issued the Edict of Milan, guaranteeing religious freedom to Christians. The bishop's release was celebrated as a true spiritual rebirth for Myra. The population gathered in crowds in front of the prison, awaiting his departure. Many wept upon seeing him so thin and weakened, yet at the same time illuminated by an expression of peace that seemed supernatural. As he crossed the gates, Nicholas made the sign of the cross over the people, as if he were blessing not only his diocese, but the entire church, reborn after years of darkness. As soon as he resumed his episcopal functions, Nicholas set about spiritually rebuilding the community. He traveled through cities and villages, re-establishing unity among Christians, encouraging forgiveness and reconciliation, and reorganizing works of charity. His time in prison had not hardened him. On the contrary, it had deepened his mercy and compassion. He knew that many had faltered out of fear during the persecution, and he did not condemn them. Instead, he welcomed them tenderly and guided them back to the path of faith. His attitude revealed the extraordinary pastoral dimension of his soul. The experience of persecution also strengthened his moral authority within the church. Bishops from other regions began to consult him on doctrinal, disciplinary, and spiritual matters. The courage he had shown during Diocletian's years was seen as a seal of Christian authenticity. Nicholas not only survived the persecution, he emerged from it even more holy, wiser, firmer, and more compassionate. This combination of virtues would make him a central figure at the Council of Nicaea, a historical event that would profoundly mark the Church's direction. But before reaching this crucial moment, he still needed to rebuild Myra, restore the people's hope, and rekindle the flame of faith, which had never been completely extinguished. Thus, the persecution did not destroy Nicholas. On the contrary, it perfected him. His quiet witness inside the prison, his unshakable fidelity, and his tireless pastoral attitude after his release consolidated him as one of the greatest bishops of his time. The fire of persecution did not consume his faith, but purified it, transforming him into a luminous example for generations. He showed with his own life that the true strength of the Church has never been in political power, but in the holiness of those who give themselves totally to Christ's love. After surviving the terrible persecution of Diocletian and resuming his episcopal mission, St. Nicholas became one of the most influential and respected bishops of the Christian East. His experience of suffering, his proven holiness, and his doctrinal firmness led to his being invited to take part in one of the most decisive moments in the history of the Church, the First Council of Nicaea, convoked by Emperor Constantine in the year 325. The objective of the council was to confront the Arian heresy, which seriously threatened the unity of the faith. The controversy, begun by Arius, a presbyter of Alexandria, asserted that Jesus was not true God, but only an exalted creature. This doctrine endangered the very foundation of Christian faith, as it denied the divinity of Christ and consequently the redemption itself. Upon arriving at the council, Nicholas already had a firm and unshakable position. Christ is true God from true God, consubstantial with the Father, eternally begotten and not created. The atmosphere of the council was intense, filled with heated theological debates, political tensions, and spiritual disputes that revealed the gravity of the crisis. Bishops from various regions brought with them the wounds of persecution, some mutilated, others blind or marked by burns, yet all united by the same purpose, to defend the faith handed down by the apostles. Nicholas, silent and attentive, followed each argument with spiritual depth, knowing that the truth needed to be proclaimed clearly in order to preserve the integrity of Christian doctrine. Arius's speeches, well articulated and apparently rational, captivated some, but caused profound indignation among the defenders of orthodoxy. Nicholas, for his part, felt that this heresy was not merely an intellectual error, but a direct attack on the mystery of the Incarnation and thus on the very salvation of humanity. According to tradition, there was a moment when Nicholas's patience was pushed to its limit. During a session in which Arius had boldly presented his ideas, vehemently denying the divinity of Christ, the saint is said to have risen, walked up to him, and struck him in the face. Although this gesture may seem impulsive, it sprang from the profound spiritual pain Nicholas experienced upon hearing God's truth so gravely distorted. The council, surprised, initially interpreted the act as a violation of ecclesiastical discipline. Nicholas was temporarily placed in custody and stripped of his episcopal vestments. However, according to ancient accounts, during the night, Christ and the Virgin Mary appeared to him, returning his vestments as a sign that his indignation had sprung from fidelity to the truth and not from disordered anger. The next morning, the guards found him mysteriously dressed once more as a bishop, holding the book of the Gospels. Impressed, the other bishops saw in this event a sign from heaven and reinstated him with due honor to the council. This episode, although surrounded by elements of pious tradition, expresses an essential truth about St. Nicholas. He could not bear any attack on the identity of Jesus Christ. His doctrinal firmness did not arise from human stubbornness, but from deep devotion to the incarnate Word. He understood that without the full divinity of Christ, no one could be saved, because only God can redeem man. His theological position, therefore, was driven by pastoral zeal and genuine love for the people who needed the truth in order to live the faith in an integral way. During the debates, Nicholas joined the great defenders of orthodoxy, such as St. Athanasius, who, though still young, stood out as the greatest opponent of Arianism. Together, they argued that the Son is of the same substance as the Father, courageously combating the idea that Christ would be inferior or subordinate. Their words, inflamed with spiritual conviction, contributed decisively to the final formulation of the Nicene Creed, which would become the basis of the Christian faith professed to this day. The inclusion of the term consubstantial, homoousios, was a monumental theological victory, ensuring that the Church's faith remained faithful to divine revelation. Nicholas left his spiritual mark on that historic moment, being remembered as one of the pillars who helped consolidate orthodoxy. Although the council was marked by intense debates and lengthy discussions, Nicholas's presence also brought a spirit of charity and humility that impressed many participants. Despite his firmness against heresy, he treated people with genuine respect, always inviting them to conversion and enlightenment. He did not see heretics as personal enemies, but as misguided souls who needed to be led back to the truth. His balance between charity and firmness showed that the true defense of the faith cannot be separated from love of neighbor. His pastoral stance made him admired not only for his holiness, but also for his wisdom and moderation. During his stay in Nicaea, Nicholas also encouraged persecuted bishops, consoled the younger ones, and assisted those who felt intimidated by the council's theological climate. Many testified that, in his presence, they experienced peace and spiritual security, as if Christ himself made himself felt through him. This ability to transmit serenity was the fruit of his inner life, deeply rooted in prayer. He frequently withdrew for moments of silence, asking God to guide his thoughts and words. The council, although it was a historically decisive moment, was for Nicholas also a spiritual battle that required discernment and humility. At the close of the council, when the condemnation of Arius was proclaimed and the Nicene Creed ratified, Nicholas felt great spiritual relief. He knew that this definition would bring security to the Church's faith and prevent future generations from being confused by erroneous doctrines. Yet he also knew that the fight against heresy would not end there. Arius still had influential supporters, and many regions would continue in doctrinal conflict. Nicholas, however, returned to Myra with renewed pastoral vigor, carrying with him the certainty that he had fulfilled his mission faithfully. The unity of the faith had been preserved, and he would continue defending the truth with courage, wisdom, and love. Upon arriving in his diocese, he was received with joy and deep respect by the faithful, who saw him not only as their bishop, but as a defender of the faith for the entire Church. He shared with the people the council's decisions, patiently explaining the importance of the doctrine that had been proclaimed there. His ability to translate complex truths into simple language enabled people to understand deeply the meaning of the creed and the greatness of Christ's divinity. The community of Myra, strengthened by Nicholas's leadership, became an example of fidelity, to Christian orthodoxy. Thus, the role of Saint Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea solidified his reputation as an ardent defender of the truth and a pastor dedicated to the faith of the people. His presence at that historic gathering was not only symbolically important, but spiritually decisive. He was the voice of tradition, humility, and courage, essential characteristics for preserving the deposit of faith. This chapter of his life shows that his holiness went far beyond the extraordinary charity for which he became famous. He was also a giant of orthodoxy, a guardian of doctrine, and a shining example of love for the eternal truth of Christ. After the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas returned to Myra not only as bishop, but as a figure of spiritual authority recognized throughout Christendom. His presence inspired respect, trust, and serenity, and the reports of his miracles began to multiply in an impressive way. The people saw in him a man truly touched by God, whose goodness was as great as his courage. One of the most famous episodes occurred when 3 military officers of the Roman Empire, unjustly accused of treason, were condemned to death without any proof. Desperate, they remembered Nicholas, whom they had previously met, and begged for his intercession even from afar. According to tradition, Nicholas appeared in a dream to Emperor Constantine and to the commander responsible, demanding that the innocent men be immediately released. Upon awakening, both, deeply impressed, obeyed. This event reinforced the people's belief that Nicholas remained vigilant against any form of injustice. In another emblematic episode, 3 young men were unjustly sentenced to execution by a corrupt magistrate who had accepted bribes to condemn them. When Nicholas heard of what had happened, he ran to the place of execution and, taken by holy zeal, placed himself between the young men and the executioner with the courage of a true shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. He confronted the magistrate in front of everyone, firmly denouncing his dishonest act and demanding the immediate release of the condemned. The magistrate, ashamed and afraid, confessed his crime before the crowd. The young men were saved, and the people once again witnessed that Nicholas did not fear confronting human authorities when innocent lives were at risk. Nicholas's fame as a defender of justice quickly spread throughout Lycia and neighboring regions. People saw in him a model of balance between mercy and firmness, someone who welcomed repentant sinners but did not tolerate oppression or injustice. This zeal did not stem from impulsiveness, but from his deep union with God, which enabled him to discern good from evil with extraordinary inner clarity. His ministry as bishop was not limited to liturgical functions. He was also a guardian of morality, peace, and social order, intervening whenever human lives were threatened by cruelty or corruption. Another impressive miracle attributed to St. Nicholas involves a terrible famine that struck the region of Myra. Ships transporting grain to Egypt made stops at ports in Lycia, and the desperate population begged the sailors for help. Nicholas, moved by compassion, asked the commanders to give part of the grain to the starving families. The sailors initially refused, fearing punishment for altering the empire's official cargo. Nicholas, however, assured them that God would replenish everything that was taken. Trusting in his word, the commanders decided to give some sacks of grain. When they reached their final destination, to everyone's astonishment, the cargo was intact, exactly at its original weight. In Myra, the multiplied grain sustained the people for 2 whole years. The episode reinforced the conviction that God honored Nicholas's faith and intercession. Among the countless popular accounts, one of the best known is the miracle of the 3 children. According to tradition, in times of scarcity, 3 boys had been kidnapped by a cruel innkeeper who killed them and used their flesh as food. When Nicholas visited the inn, he immediately perceived the presence of evil and, faced with the horror of the crime, prayed with deep sorrow. The children were miraculously brought back to life and ran into the saint's arms, who consoled them and returned them to their families. Although this account includes symbolic elements, it represents the people's deep faith in Nicholas's ability to restore life and protect the innocent. He thus became patron of children and a symbol of divine tenderness manifested in human history. Nicholas's ability to transform situations of despair into moments of hope was due not only to extraordinary miracles, but also to his strong and welcoming spiritual presence. He knew how to listen, advise, and console like few others. Widows found in him a tireless defender. Orphans were cared for with fatherly love. Sailors entrusted their lives to his protection, and the poor sought him as someone who never failed to share the little he had. His entire life was a reflection of the gospel lived in a radical and concrete way. Wherever he went, peace seemed to follow him, as if God's very presence became more perceptible in the atmosphere he left behind. Another remarkable episode occurred when a terrible storm threatened to sink a ship full of passengers. The sailors, in despair, called upon St. Nicholas, remembering his earlier miracle in favor of seafarers. According to the account, the saint appeared over the waves, calming the winds with a simple gesture and guiding the ship to a safe place. The passengers, astonished, gave thanks to God for his mercy and proclaimed Nicholas protector of those who travel by sea. Since then, his devotion among sailors spread throughout the Mediterranean, and he is still invoked today by those who face the dangers of the waters. As the years passed, Nicholas's holiness became impossible to hide. Even as he tried to live simply and detached, his fame grew irresistibly. People came from afar to ask for miracles, blessings, and guidance. Some recounted that it was enough to look at him to feel God's presence. Others said that his words penetrated the heart with a power that no human speech could achieve. Nicholas, however, remained humble, aware that he did nothing by his own merit. For him, every miracle was the exclusive work of Christ, and he was nothing more than an instrument of divine will. Even in old age, his pastoral care never diminished. He continued traveling through villages, consoling the sick and encouraging the faithful to remain firm in the faith. The years had left on him the marks of experience, but had not lessened his spiritual energy. His face was serene, his eyes shone with compassion, and his words were always measured, full of wisdom and love. Nicholas knew that his mission was drawing to a close, but he wished to finish his life serving just as he had always served, giving himself totally to God and to his people. His heart burned with gratitude for the grace of having lived every moment as a witness to divine love. Thus, the life of St. Nicholas, marked by miracles, justice, and charity, became a true icon of Christian holiness. He was not just a wonder worker, but a shepherd who loved his people deeply, a defender of the innocent, a friend of the poor, and a guardian of the truth. His fame was not popular exaggeration, but the concrete reflection of a life completely surrendered to Christ. Every miracle, every intervention, every gesture of mercy showed that God acted powerfully through his faithful servant. And as the hour of his departure approached, the people already knew that the memory of that holy man would remain alive for centuries, radiating light, hope, and faith. As age advanced, St. Nicholas began to feel that his earthly mission was drawing to an end. Even so, he did not lessen his pace of pastoral dedication. He continued visiting the poor, listening to the afflicted, advising the young and consoling the sick. Every gesture, every word, every blessing he gave seemed to carry an eternal weight, as if he were already inwardly preparing himself for the definitive encounter with God. His serene presence was perceived with even greater reverence by the faithful, who knew they were in the presence of a truly holy man. Although his body showed signs of weariness, his spirit remained luminous, full of fervor and love. Many testified that upon approaching him, they felt such deep peace that their anxieties disappeared like snow melting in the sun. As his health declined, Nicholas intensified his life of prayer. He spent long periods before the altar, silently conversing with God, thanking him for the privilege of having served as bishop and asking forgiveness for his human limitations. He understood that holiness does not consist in never making mistakes, but in remaining humble, docile to the Holy Spirit, and always willing to begin again. He no longer desired anything for himself, neither recognition, nor rest, nor honor. He wanted only to give his soul to the Creator with the same simplicity with which he had lived his entire life. His face, though aged, seemed to radiate a kind of inner light that impressed all who visited him in his final days. His death occurred around the year 343 in an atmosphere of profound spiritual peace. The faithful gathered around his episcopal residence, praying, weeping, and asking God to receive him into his glory. Nicholas, surrounded by priests and Christians who sincerely loved him, made the sign of the cross with his last conscious gesture and gave his soul to the Lord. There was no turmoil, no torment, no agony, just a silent passage from this world to eternity, typical of saints who have lived in fidelity. The people immediately began proclaiming his sanctity, and the city of Myra sank into mourning, recognizing that it had lost not only a bishop but a spiritual father, a protector, and a faithful friend. His burial was accompanied by an innumerable multitude. Men, women, children, the elderly, everyone wanted to pay their last respects to the one who had touched their lives with gestures of mercy and words of comfort. Many accounts indicate that miracles began to occur before his tomb immediately after his death, especially healings and special graces granted to those who invoked him with faith. The fame of these signs spread rapidly, drawing pilgrims from various regions. The church where his body rested became one of the most important centers of devotion in the Christian East, further reinforcing the conviction that Nicholas was truly a saint of the Lord. As the centuries passed, devotion to St. Nicholas crossed borders and reached the entire world. He became patron of sailors, for many ships bore witness to his miraculous intercession. He became protector of children, thanks to accounts of rescues and miracles involving helpless little ones. He became guardian of poor families because of the famous story of the 3 young women saved by the providential dowry. He became defender of innocent people unjustly persecuted, for he never tolerated corruption or abuse of authority. His figure traversed cultures, languages, and traditions, being venerated both in the East and in the West, something rare and precious in the history of the Church. In the Middle Ages, his devotion flourished in an extraordinary way. Churches were dedicated in his name throughout Europe. Confraternities arose to promote his memory. Relics associated with the saint became objects of great reverence, especially after the transfer of his mortal remains from the city of Myra to Bari, in Italy, in 1087. The basilica built in his honor became a place of pilgrimage that remains to this day, attracting the faithful from all continents. During this time, popular traditions associated with Nicholas's generous figure also began to appear, especially the practice of distributing gifts to children on his liturgical feast, celebrated on December 6th. Over time, the image of Saint Nicholas as protector of children and giver of gifts evolved in different cultures, giving rise to various representations. In Germanic and Nordic regions, local traditions incorporated elements of folklore and transformed St. Nicholas into figures such as Santa Claus and Nikolaus, celebrated with joy and Christian spirit. Later, these traditions merged with customs brought by immigrants to the United States, culminating in the cultural figure of Santa Claus. Although this modern representation has been distorted and commercialized, its root remains deeply Christian, a holy bishop who dedicated his life to loving the poor, protecting the innocent, and acting with hidden generosity. The Catholic Church has always taken care to preserve the true meaning of devotion to Saint Nicholas, emphasizing that his holiness does not lie in fantasy, but in the real, concrete, and profound charity he practiced. His gestures were the fruit of the gospel, not of folklore. His generosity was a reflection of God's goodness, not of human imagination. And it is precisely this spiritual authenticity that makes his figure still so beloved. The faithful do not venerate him for being a cultural symbol, but for having been a man who embodied mercy and lived Christian love with radicalism. He is a living example of how holiness transforms the world, beginning with the simplest gestures. Today, Saint Nicholas remains one of the most beloved saints of Christendom. His name is synonymous with goodness, justice, and hope. Millions of people invoke him daily, trusting in his powerful intercession before God. His story is remembered in sermons, catechesis, books, and celebrations, especially during Advent, a period in which his life becomes an inspiration for the practice of charity and spiritual preparation for Christmas. In a world often marked by selfishness and superficiality, Saint Nicholas reminds us of the importance of living with generosity, courage, and deep faith. The legacy of Saint Nicholas remains alive because it is rooted in the gospel. He did not leave behind theological treatises, did not found religious orders, and did not accomplish grand military feats. He simply loved. He loved intensely, truthfully, humbly. He loved to the end, without seeking glory, without expecting recognition. His life was a mirror of Christ's compassion, and that is why his memory remains indelible. The world changes, empires fall, customs are transformed, but authentic charity never dies. And as long as there are Christians who wish to imitate the love of Jesus, the name of Saint Nicholas will continue to be spoken with devotion, gratitude, and joy.